Welcome back to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and in this episode 179, it's a great pleasure to welcome back Nora Gedgaudas. Nora is widely regarded as an expert on the Paleo diet. She's a board-certified nutritional consultant and a speaker and educator. She wrote the book Primal Body, Primal Mind, and its follow-up, Primal Fat Burner. In this conversation, Nora not only shares with us or reminds us of those basic principles of a high-fat diet and why it confers so many health benefits on us, but she also shares with us her personal story of getting out of the matrix and moving from city life in Portland, Oregon, to the remote mountains of Idaho. Nora, welcome back to the podcast. It's been a long time since we last saw you. And
it has been a long time, Nigel. And you're one of my favorite humans over there across the pond. And thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure, real pleasure to be here and to be with you.
Great stuff. Well, it's a long time since we spoke, and you've helped clue my audience in on the whole fat burning issue in the past. So maybe we can touch on that in this conversation. But first of all, I gather your life is somewhat shifted towards sort of outside the matrix living, you could say, and you've moved.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it.
Yeah. So do tell us what's been the change in your life.
Well, the change in my life was about 5 years ago when the world lost its mind, and I was living right in the belly of the beast, of course, Portland, Oregon. And, I had been also dealing with a mother that had advanced Alzheimer's. She's since passed away now. But that was very full time for me. So I was actually I'd sort of gone dark for my audience for a while during that whole ordeal because it was a very, very full time thing. And, but when the whole, COVID pandemic, whatever, happened, I didn't spend 5 seconds fearful of this invisible viral spook from China. I'd watched Big Pharma try to sell us a pandemic every year for like 20 years, and they made a number of attempts at that. And I knew that Bill Gates was working on his ID20. He called it ID 2020. And I thought, and that was supposed to have vaccine information on this universal digital ID card, which I wasn't going to participate in. But I thought, how are they going to get people to go along with this? And when the whole story sort of broke and you see people face planting in China and stuff, and I'm just sort of doing this going, oh, God. I realized, especially once they started using terms like lockdown, which is not a medical term, it's a prison term. And I know enough. I mean, I spent more than 20 years in healthcare, closer to 30 now, I guess. And I knew that everything they were telling us to do was exactly the opposite of what we needed to be doing. Nothing they told us made sense. But people I was astonished at the rate at which people, especially where I was living, immediately just went into fear mode and strapped the diapers on their faces and started shunning each other, at least 6 feet, it's like no science there. Yeah. What the hell? So I looked at my partner and I said, we have to get the hell out of here. I knew that cities were going to be very bad very, very quickly. And I traveled through 5 different states looking for what I wanted as off-grid property. I've had some off-grid experience in northeastern Minnesota. I had a log cabin on 40 acres. A good friend of mine still has that property. And they're living there full time now too. So I wasn't completely new to the idea, but I knew it was going to be a really, really good idea. I saw the climate stuff playing into this. I knew they were going to conflate those things. And I just thought, all right, so I ended up finding, 53 acres of, paradise basically. I'm in the Clearwater Mountains at about 4,000 feet of elevation in Idaho,
Yeah.
which is part of the Rocky Mountains, and 100% off grid basically.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
have access, obviously, to internet. There was one tree I had to take down in order to access a better cell signal. I had satellite initially when I got here, HughesNet, and it was terrible. So I had to switch to something else if I was going to have any kind of business outside of just, my life here.
Yeah.
But best move I ever made. Um, and I hit the ground running when we got here. And there was already kind of a plug and play situation, but it all needed revamping and updating. And there's a massive amount of renovation and new innovation and whatever. So now I have there was a large mature orchard. I built close to, I guess about a 27-foot greenhouse, 4-season greenhouse. And there's a huge garden area. There's food forest surrounding on all sides. There are wild mountain springs all over the property, and there's one up on the hill that just gravity feeds, fresh, pristine mountain spring water down the hill right into my house. And I have normal plumbing, no outhouse. And electricity is, I make enough electricity to be very comfortable with whatever it is I want to do. I can even blow dry my hair, which we know is very important. So anyway, raising some different animals, but it's not a farm, everything is, I wanted to keep the wilderness nature of things, intact. So I don't hear, little goat
Do you
sounds
have
and
many
things.
neighbors? Are you living, is this a sort of obviously very rural
Well, it's
setting?
remote.
Yeah.
It's remote wilderness. So yeah, there are some other homesteads on this mountain.
Mhm.
A lot of people are here for not dissimilar reasons from the reason I'm here.
Yeah.
Some people are here because maybe they're a little bit misfit and don't really fit in anywhere else. Some people are here because they don't like people very much. So we don't have them over for barbecues, but I get along with most everybody.
Yeah.
And a number of people are, well, there aren't that many people, but some of my neighbors are off grid. And
And how are you
it
finding this new lifestyle and in compared to being in because you were in Portland, I think, before that, um,
well,
compared to city life or town life?
I've always been drawn to wilderness my whole life. And, I spent that time in the Arctic living with wild wolves. I spent so much time going off by myself into the deep forest, for days or even, a week or two at a time and on my own. And I don't run off by myself now, because, with mountain lions and potentially grizzly bears and black bears and
Yeah.
different things up here. It's smarter to not do that. But I carry protection with me if I go to a far side of the property.
Yeah.
Um, but I cannot imagine living any other way. And I always knew I would end up in a place like this. That was kind of from the time I was a child. That's something I knew I wanted more than anything. So
So,
it's
excuse me interrupting, but so how much of your choice to move to that location is sort of, guarding against the mayhem that's coming and the political agenda of collectivism and
yeah.
future lockdowns versus, I mean, obviously it's great to be somewhere remote and to be,
Right.
I
Well,
get that.
so I thought about it a lot of years, while I was living in Portland. I had a great life there. I really did. I had a small home, about 1,000 square foot home, but it was completely privacy fenced in. So I had this little magical universe there, on that property that I put my whole heart and soul into. It was pure magic. You walk through an arbor with all this bamboo and everything, and suddenly it's like a Disney movie, um, and all the little birds and animals and things. And it was peaceful. It was wonderful. Documentaries got filmed there. I knew a lot of well-known people that came and stayed there. Um, and I loved it. And that's what made it a little hard, was that I still thought, well, how will I ever, I used to think, well, maybe I'll make enough money at some point where I can afford to have two places and I'll have this as, and then I'll be able to have this other. When all this stuff started happening, it was like the universe ripping off the Band-Aid for me, really.
Yeah.
I just looked at the situation and said, okay, it's time. Now it's time. We have to go.
Yeah. I mean,
And
go on, sorry.
no, it was a very, very, I believe it was probably the smartest, wisest thing I ever did. And I live in an area, it's a constitutional county, if you have any idea of what that means.
No, I don't.
So with the United States Constitution, one of the things that makes it so fabulous is that the greatest powers in this country are not bestowed upon the federal government. They are bestowed to the most localized jurisdictions.
Okay.
And the most important person in my life to protect me from government overreach is actually my local sheriff.
Yeah.
Way more important than the president or the governor or, even, county officials or whatever else. And the sheriff of this county is steadfast constitutionalist, which means that his job is to protect my freedom and well-being and to protect me from government overreach. And all of the deputies are on that same page. And it's the most wonderful law enforcement,
Yeah.
People around here. And most people like this area also, because it's a bit more conservative, well, anything is more conservative than Portland. And it's interesting, when the lockdowns were happening everywhere else, they never really happened here. I think there were the sheriff said, it's up to you guys, whatever you want to do. And a couple businesses closed down for a few days and then said, to hell with this, and reopened. And when I got there were no masks there. You go into the cafe and, and the waitress is smiling at you. You go past the playgrounds, children are smiling and laughing and playing, while people living in the cities are cowering in terror from one another. It was, and I think the hardest part of all that for me was the dehumanizing nature of it all. I really relish and being fully human, and I think being fully human means that we need, communion with other humans, right?
Yeah.
And it was to go out to public places and see the little circles drawn on the floor and to see people's faces covered and little eyes darting around, in fear that you might step too close to them. And,
It was dreadful, wasn't it?
that was mentally, emotionally extremely difficult for me to see that. The only thing I was afraid of was government overreach, honestly.
Yeah.
And I knew I needed to get someplace where my values in terms of being human were going to be much more protected. And it's a very free place where I'm at, and almost everybody's armed to the nines. You go into the grocery store, you see holsters, whatever. So like if there's trouble, somebody's got your back covered.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any illegal migrants around here. None of that stuff has really touched us where we are. And
it sounds perfect for as a, I mean, okay, some people might not like to be too remote, but it does sound like you're a safe distance from the long arm of the state. I mean, I'd like to think that, my podcast is called Living Outside the Matrix because that's what my life is about. And to a certain extent,
come visit.
Yeah, I'd love
right?
to. I'm sort of outside the system, and yet I'm relatively close to London. So it's a bit of a anathema, I suppose. It's a bit of a strange one. It might seem a contradiction to some people, but I tend not to sort of publicize those aspects of my life too much.
No,
I totally understand the idea of isolating oneself from the long arm of the state, and even after COVID, I looked into packing my family up from where we are in the UK and getting on a sailboat and trying to find another country, another jurisdiction, and somewhere else. We looked at all sorts of crazy places. But ultimately, we decided to stay where we've invested a lot of time and effort, and we've got water wells, and we've got a
Yeah, if you
set
have
up.
resources and you have community where you are, that accounts for a lot. I
Yeah,
mean, unfortunately, the EU and the UK, are more controlled by centralized power systems. Our power system in the United States is very decentralized, you know, and so it's when I had friends who were running off to Ecuador and Hawaii, God help them, and whatever, and it's like that's such a bad idea to be on an island somewhere.
yeah,
Well, of course, Britain, but it's a
bigger
little
island.
bigger. Yeah, bigger island. Um, but the thing about the United States, and I'm not a big flag waver, but I do have a renewed appreciation for what the founding fathers of this country had in mind. They were brilliant. And of
Yeah,
course, they were experiencing something not dissimilar when they created what they created here. They understood the machinations of totalitarianism and controlling political structures and monarchies and whatever else. And they drafted something that was really accounted for almost everything except for, of course, modern technology and whatever else. But the basic principles that established the way we live in this country gave everyone living here an authentic sense of being entitled to freedom, which is not necessarily the same mentality everywhere else in the world. A lot of people are sort of used to being told what to do.
absolutely. I mean,
It,
America was the first country born in freedom, wasn't it? I mean,
yeah,
what you're saying with the
absolutely.
founding fathers, it really was an amazing achievement.
And I knew because of that, there was going to be a scrappiness when it came to a totalitarian takeover of this country, that Americans were only going to put up with so much, or at least Americans that valued those principles, right? A lot of it was starting to be denounced in schools. So a lot of younger people really just don't understand and don't have the appreciation. But friends of mine that went running off to banana republics in Central and South America, it's like, really? Um, where are your protections going to come from? Just, and unless unless you are able to, number one, I don't think it's great when you have, you know, intrinsically unstable government structures to put your eggs in that basket. And of course, Central and South America is notorious for being very unstable in terms of, political structures, but and revolutions and all kinds of, guerrilla warfare and things like that. And now, of course, narco states and things. Um, but people that if somebody is really intent on living abroad someplace, I think that you're a fool to do it unless if and only if you have a mastery of that native language, whatever that language is.
Yeah,
And hopefully you also look like you fit in, right?
yeah,
So that it's easier for you to create networks and community and whatever else. I have friends living in Nicaragua, they're expat Canadians, and they're not sure if they're safe or not because they haven't really mastered the language yet. They like where they are, but they're not sure who to trust,
yeah.
and they
It
have a
takes a
hard time
long while,
expressing
doesn't it?
themselves.
It takes a
It's one
long
thing to be
time.
able to say, I took high school and college Spanish, so tengo un lápiz rojo. I have a red pencil. ¿Dónde
Yeah,
está el cuarto de baño? Yeah, where's the bathroom? Okay, basic phrases and basic communication. But if you really want to have deep, meaningful relationships, it requires a tremendous amount of nuance and mastery of a language to have that. I spent time in Peru a few years ago. I was wanting to see Machu Picchu, and I also just had some wonderful experiences in the northern part of Peru and also in the Andes. And but I also there's so much petty crime, and I was trying to film. I thought I was going to film a documentary. I had great footage, and I had $10,000 worth of camera equipment stolen from me.
oh no.
Right. It was so traumatizing. And I was trying to catch a plane to Lima from where I was in this kind of remote area. And arrogantly assumed most people would have some grasp of English because there was so much tourism, gringo tourism. Oh no. And that was an arrogant assumption on my part. And even with my rudimentary Spanish, I couldn't communicate.
Yeah.
It was impossible. I spent a whole day in an non-air conditioned police, office in Lima, trying to explain everything that had been stolen. They're trying to, and nobody there speaks English, and my Spanish is, like horrible.
Yeah.
And I thought, never again. I'm just not interested in going back to that part of the world. I had other things stolen there too. I mean, it was just terrible that
I mean,
way.
it sounds like where you are now is ideal. You've got community, you've got
Mhm.
similarly minded people who value their privacy and security.
Right.
You
Look,
know,
when things go sideways, it's hard enough, you know, if somebody's screaming at you in a language you can understand, right? You
yeah,
know,
that's hard enough to deal
right.
with.
So I think community is the most important thing. Honestly, that's the currency of the future, right? Relationships of trust,
Yeah,
but also having some degree of food security and having decentralized systems in place that allow you to either barter or where you're not relying on centralized systems like, oh, I don't know, the grid, or other things which are very tenuous nowadays. I knew sooner or later there were going to be supply line shortages, all kinds of things. And even though a lot of people are feeling better now, well, I mean, at least the president doesn't have dementia now. But so
that's
a
an
little more
improvement.
ostensibly running more things in a more transparent manner. Uh, but and it's okay to feel good about some of what has occurred with that, but I don't take any of it for granted at all. And there's been so much damage done to the economy and to the social structure of this country, which I do believe is probably destined to fracture into different, I don't know, enclaves, if you will. Like the United States, I think could easily fracture into because the polarizations are so deep. A lot of the cities now are just are chaotic and still filled with uh, well homelessness and rioting and a lot of illegal migrants from countries that don't like us very much, um, but certainly feel entitled to certain things. um it's it's good to be away from that.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to me also that when the sort of proverbial stuff hits the fan, and we need to be able to be self-reliant and off-grid and hopefully have some animals or some food
Yeah,
growing, so we've, got some sort of head start when the supermarket shelves are empty. It's somebody in a position like you, and I'd like to consider myself in a similar situation, have got something of a head start over
oh
everybody
brother.
else. So when everything falls to pieces, and you and I will at least have a few years of, okay, well, this is normal. We're used to this, we're used to that. So okay, it would still be unpleasant and challenging in various ways for all of us. If there's any kind of societal collapse or totalitarian state
Right.
takeover, it's always going to be difficult. But the earlier you can sort of start getting used to being without certain things, or no, that sounds too negative. Being more self-reliant, across many aspects of your life. I think the better, the earlier we can do that. So
Well, every so often I run across somebody who says, "Yeah, that's really cool that you're doing. I'm thinking, like maybe in a couple of years I'd like to get some land." It's like, if you haven't done this already, if you haven't taken those steps, unless there is a miracle that's bestowed upon you, I don't see right now. Properties like this are nearly impossible to find now.
really,
I knew it was important to go while my house was still worth something. It was actually worth most of what I wanted to get out of it. Um, and what I bought here was probably a fourth as expensive as it would be now. So I would never be able to afford to buy this place now. But back then it was doable, it was doable.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think if anybody has designs, you know, I mean, when would now be the best time to, to get out and find something? And, there are, there are kind of, shall we say, intentional communities around that are off grid, and there are some entrepreneurs that have created, remote retreat communities in the middle of nowhere and things. So there are ways of getting into something like that, which is probably more realistic now than buying land and then starting from scratch. This was enough of a plug and play situation here that um
You mean
that
things were sort of reasonably up and running? Yeah.
well, yeah, there was, so I had both solar and hydroelectric power. There's a creek
Okay.
running through the property year round, and there's an orchard, and there's there's plumbing, the electricity worked. It just needed to be updated quite a bit. um and I probably saved myself 15 to 20 years by buying what I did,
Yes.
because to start from nothing and try to create something
Takes a
is,
lifetime.
oh my God. Every so often I run across somebody that says, yeah, man, me and my friends, we're going to buy some land and we're going to grow our own food. And it's like, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. It's a steep learning curve too,
It is a steep learning curve. I've known so many people who've said that, so many people who have come to our small farm,
Yeah.
and everyone says they want to buy land, and everyone says they want to sort of live outside the matrix. Everyone says that they want to do this, that, and the other. And it's always, it keeps disappearing over the horizon, and it,
Someday tends to be a road that leads to nowhere,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And,
But,
yeah, so.
yeah, I mean, I have been seriously concerned about the political developments, and in some respects, I'd love to be, more where you are than 30 miles north of London, which is
London used to be my favorite city. Well, that, and I used to love Vancouver, British Columbia too.
yeah,
Which, I'll never see again. And I doubt I'll ever see London again. My plan is to never get on another airplane or
yeah,
really see another city. I'd rather remember certain places as they were, like Portland. I'll never go back there for any reason,
yeah, yeah.
you know?
I mean, America is somewhere that my family would love to come and visit, and we have family out there, where you are, at the other side of the country. But it's difficult. I mean, all the nonsense with the COVID that we're talking about, and the sort of, needing a vaccination to get a visa, and there's travel in the future. It's another thing that's being phased out, isn't it, with the climate nonsense?
Right.
We're not going to be able to travel around, and the idea of having to take a vaccination in order to travel is just insane. I mean, there's no
Right.
way, no way I'm going to do that with my family. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're well poised for a sort of a rocky future, which I think, sadly, inevitably, is probably, or challenging future, should I say, is
Yeah.
probably what we face.
Yeah. It has allowed it, yeah, I mean, what was I gonna, I don't know. It's, it's allowed me to kind of clear out my head. And every time I look out the window, I mean, the views here are unbelievable. Um, it just puts everything in perspective. I think, nature is the purest expression of the divine that we have, so there is an automatic sense of being plugged in sort of spiritually, when you're living in alignment with, Mother Nature's natural rhythms and, uh, and the animals. And I mean, it's, this is, also just, I mean, that I'm friends with a lot of the deer on the property. They'll walk up to me and nuzzle my hand, and it's just, it's again, sort of like a Disney movie, except without the pedophiles, of course. Right. But, uh, and it has allowed me to have a clear head so that I have more to offer other people again.
Yeah.
Now that I've kind of settled in, and I've done most of what I've needed to do to get myself set up here. Now I'm a little freer to, well, and I've also been very active
Yeah. I
over
think
the
there are a
last
lot.
decade or so with the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation, which is a
Yeah.
73-year-old, organization, curating the works and the writings and the photographs and of Weston Price and about a dozen other nutritional pioneers like Francis Pottinger and Royal Lee and others. Um, and so we've been very active in trying to do outreach and to make we become more activistic, if you will, and we're reaching out more and trying to provide authentic value to our members. And we've created an initiative that I sort of insisted upon called the Food Freedom Project, which is not just about how to grow tomatoes and zucchini in your backyard. Who lives on that? It's nearly impossible to do everything as a sovereign individual or even family that you'd need to do in order to, you know, to be quote unquote self-sustaining. It's not practical. We're kind of trying to do that here, and we've succeeded in a large measure, but it's not practical for most people.
You need a division of labor and
You need a
a
division of
community.
labor, right?
Yeah.
So it's all what the Food Freedom Project really has to do with is creating decentralized food systems and communities that are committed to working together to shore up each other's, weaknesses, with one another's strengths, and to give people a sense that they're not alone, right? I'm not into being all by myself in the middle of nowhere. I have friends, there are humans here that I have wonderful relationships with. And at some point, we may have more of a community on the property as well. But right now, um, it's yeah, it's I wake up and I want to kiss the ground every single morning, seeing a
Sounds
glorious
great.
sunrise over the mountains and stuff.
Yeah, it
It's
sounds lovely.
it's very, very special. So yeah, but that said, I'm not completely unplugged from the world, and I have been doing more interviews of late, and I'm very active doing interviews with some fairly well-known people through the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation, um and
And
you
you're able
know,
to conduct, your commercial life from this relatively remote location, because that's key, isn't it? For a lot of people, earning money when you go and live outside the matrix somewhere is a challenge, But obviously, using the
it
internet.
is a challenge. I mean, like I still do some consulting work, health-wise, and I do have some semi-regular consultations that I do that way. I've also started offering consultations to people who are trying to figure their lives out in light of the world, and how they might need to help people figure out how they might need to think about their situation in a way that makes it more tenable for them. Um, if they're interested in doing something off grid. I mean, I've learned so much. I have a lot to offer people that are interested in this way of life, but it doesn't necessarily take this way of life to be in a better situation than someone might otherwise be in, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, if people can find any way of getting the hell out of the city, I urge them to do it, there's no good that can come from staying in a city. But
It comes down to controllability, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of the political situation, if you're in a high-rise block of flats an urban environment in the city, you really have far fewer options than somebody who's got a few acres of land.
right,
Uh,
you have
you
more
know,
than you might think, because there are ways of doing things. There are ways of creating your own food in an apartment. I mean, you can even raise quail. They don't take up much room. They're prolific, and they're not expensive to feed, but you have to figure out how to feed them. Um, but I mean, there are things you can do,
yeah,
um, but it makes it a lot harder. And so figuring out, who your friends are, who your relationship, who are your relationships of trust. That is where the gold lies.
yeah,
It's not in the stock market. It's not in precious metals. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having diversified financial investments and things, but in the end, the real money is who you know, who you trust, who's there, who has your back. Who do you love? Who loves you?
Yeah. And
This is,
also,
it's about being human.
it is, isn't it? And also health. I mean, perhaps we'll shift on to the health
There we
thing as
go. Yeah.
well. But health is very much become a political issue, isn't it? And obviously, COVID. We started off this conversation looking back at that sort of nightmare, and it was very clear to see that it was a political tool. The idea of sort of quarantining people it's the potential for political control of a population using a pandemic is enormous, and mandatory vaccines, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But so it really behoves all of us these days that want to be free to know how to be independently healthy. Here in England, there's a lot of dependence on the national health system, but we really have to learn to guarantee our own health independently, don't we?
I think all of the best people operating within the mainstream healthcare system who were there for the right reasons, doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, who were patient-centered, whatever, most of them have left. What's left are the obedient yes people collecting a paycheck and just willing to do whatever they're told to keep that paycheck.
Yeah.
And who have gone into maybe some state of denial over what it is they've been facilitating over the last number of years. And the mainstream, what they call it healthcare system, it's really disease management system, right? It's about the more ill people are, the more profitable the system becomes. The more you can give people something that will alleviate their immediate symptoms but create longer term problems, you keep the cash flow going.
And the more
we have a new HHS secretary here now, that Bobby Kennedy, who is determined to flip that around. And God bless him. I hope he succeeds. He's a smart man. We do have some wonderful people, I think, in positions of power now, and who are authentically looking to revamp the system. But in the meantime, I can't think of, there are a lot of physicians operating outside the system, doing little boutique things, doing consultations online and, whatever else. But God forbid you should need inpatient care somewhere.
Yes.
Or, of course, what I worry about is like, I don't know, chainsawing one of my legs off, or, or having an unfortunate encounter with a mountain lion or something, to where emergency healthcare might be needed. I'm not that far from a small, clinic that can handle basic things. And I have there's practically a medical clinic in this home, just in terms of all kinds of medical supplies and all sorts of things needed.
Yeah.
I don't worry about, infectious disease or things like that at all. I think we're well situated to deal with that. It's more like, traumatic injury, a car accident or whatever.
Yeah.
I drive to town, maybe once a month. I don't, the largest population center close to me, which is about 100 miles away, large population center. I hesitate to call it a city. I don't really want to have to see it more than once a year, But yeah,
do you have things like stitch a bad cut?
Oh yeah,
facilities there that are accessible. Yeah, that.
Well, I have that in my own home.
Oh, okay. Right,
But and then there are people living near here that that have some medical skills as well and whatnot. And I have a few, but
we need these skills. I think it's quite important. But again, it comes down to the basic knowledge of how to make yourself healthy.
Health has to be the primary focus for anybody and everybody.
Absolutely,
right now.
Absolutely.
You do not want to go into that beast, that meat grinder of a system for anything if you can avoid it.
People who go into the hospital for even minor, procedures here in the UK usually end up getting some sort of complication just from being in the hospital. But more broadly than that, I mean, it's so important, isn't it? Because without a functioning body, you can't live, you can't do anything. So, I mean, it can't be overstated how important health is, but hopefully that's relatively self-evident to people. But my concern, Nora, is that in this political situation we're in, there's been some fabulous voices on the internet over the last 10 years. And the resource of knowledge that I've dipped into, and from people like yourself with primal body, primal mind, fantastic resource. On that centered around the paleo and burning fat, and we'll come into that.
Right.
But there's been so much fantastic information to empower the individual. Do you suspect there's some sort of backlash against that? Do you think that the powers that shouldn't be would prefer us to not sort of be enjoying all that information?
I think So I think where you are in the EU, God help anybody there. I very fearful, about that. Here it's gotten. Look, the person that drafted the Great Barrington Declaration, who was marginalized and vilified and dragged through the mud and stripped of whatever, is now heading up one of our major health agencies, right? Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who's an amazing human being. And so things have flipped a bit here. There's freedom of speech for the most part has returned. There's still social media. Mainstream social media is, still an animal that, that needs to be kind of put in its place. It hasn't been to the extent it needs to be yet, but it's still a lot easier. People are much freer to share information now. And I've seen, so I think when this whole thing started, there were about 30% of the population that bought into it hook, line, and sinker, and just, and there was maybe another 30% that thought, I'm not sure I buy into this, but I'll go along to get along. And then there was the other, 33 and a third percent of us who said, under no circumstances will I participate with this, like ever. I don't care what you do to me. I am not going to comply. I would say that number now has expanded quite a bit. I would say more than half of this country is to some degree or another awake and aware that we've been bamboozled and duped, and that whoever was in charge of what happened over the last 5 years, did not have good intentions. They did not have our best, our best interests at heart.
Yeah.
And so more people are getting involved. More average people are getting. There was one woman, for instance. I'd have to look it up exactly where she was now. She was jailed for keeping her salon open during the whole lockdown thing. Her small business, and she was jailed for that. Now she has been elected to office, and she's a smart woman, and she's active in a lot of these things. There are people getting involved who understand that this is a country by, of, and not just for the people, who are really paying attention to what goes on. Idaho, the state where I live, just passed the most comprehensive health freedom bill anywhere in the country. That not only, they passed a couple things. One bill they passed, even though we exited the who knows, one-term president, what somebody might do in the future. This state will never comply with anything the WHO tells us to do. Furthermore,
fantastic.
And we've also had now a law passed that gives the individual sovereign freedom over their own healthcare decisions, not just when it comes to injections, but when it comes to any medical procedure. We now have as total a health freedom as anybody could ever hope for. And in this state, no more mandates.
Yeah.
No one here is going to put up with them anymore.
Yeah. Well, that sounds
and
great.
That's been written into law. Yeah.
I mean, that sounds great. And it sounds like from the figures you were talking about there earlier, a few moments ago, It sounds like, maybe people were a little bit more sort of switched on over in your country than they are here. I was the only person in my local supermarket, which is quite large, only person not wearing a mask. Everyone else was diapered up. It was tragic. I felt very, very, and I think that the percentage of people here who would just not comply was maybe a bit smaller than where you are. But this brings me back to this issue of health, though, and how important it is. That do you think that for example, I mean, you are one of the writers that educated me, with Primal Body, Primal Mind, on the importance of burning fat, ketosis or metabolic flexibility.
I don't use that term. I think that's a made up term.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
and I think that's problematic.
Okay.
One of an illustration so I don't know if you read Primal Fat Burner or not.
I haven't. If not, no.
Oh my God. No, well, you need to go out and get that one.
Okay.
But do I have? I've got a copy laying around here somewhere. But I urge you to, because it's got more updated information in it, and it tells a story. It's not so much 10 books in one, the way Primal Body, Primal Mind was, but I was able to take advantage of newer research and also newer things that,
yeah.
My whole journey was one of dot connecting, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't just like looking at studies that said, yeah, fat burning is good or whatever. I was looking at how did we evolve? What were the selective pressures that shaped us as a species,
Yeah.
And what is our physiological makeup? What are the most fundamental nutritional requirements that we have as a species?
Yeah.
And you can look at the work of Weston Price, and I certainly have. He was immensely influential for me. But I was also able to go much further back. I wanted to really look at our origins. How did we develop into what we are now?
Yeah.
What gave us our big brains, which are made up of almost pure fat. And we effectively, became human by surviving disasters, I mean, this planet has always been an unstable place climatically. Yes, climate change, of course. Welcome to planet Earth.
Yeah.
Things are always changing.
Yeah.
In one direction or another. Weather is not climate change. Arson is not climate change.
Yeah. Forest fires being lit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, yeah. But we've there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest now that civilizations have come and gone. Advanced civilizations have come and gone.
Absolutely.
I'm a fan of people like Graham Hancock, that you have over there, who's just a gem. Randall Carlson, who's knows more than all the geologists and so-called climate scientists all wrapped into all together. He knows more than all of them put together, I think. Disaster is something that we're here because we were innovative enough to do that. And
thinking capacity, our ability to problem solve and to, as you say, survive disasters because we've got the rational faculty.
Well, Weston Price, when he did what he did, a lot of his devotees, shall we say, came to the conclusion, based on his 100,000 miles of travel over 10 years and all these different cultures around the world that had very, very different diets from one another. He asked himself a very important question. He said, what did all of these, what did all of the healthiest cultures that I studied have in common in terms of their diets? Number one, they all consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them in the greatest variety possible. He was not able to find a vegetarian or vegan culture anywhere. I mean, he was very disappointed in that, actually. He really thought he'd find that, but he really didn't. The other thing was that the most important food, the most venerated, the most sought after, and the most sacred foods were those that were highest in fat and fat-soluble nutrients, particularly of animal origin.
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies the foundational basis for the most important nutritional requirements of every human.
Yeah.
What defines us as a species, they always talk about bioindividuality, and I just want to rip my hair out of my head So, what defines us as a species are not our differences, right? They're the things that we have in common. Yes, we all have individual fingerprints, but we all have fingers, right? And so to me, those bio individual either polymorphisms or other little bugaboos like food sensitivities and things like that, those are nuance in the scheme of things, but they don't define us as a species. There's all sorts of reason to, not just reason, all sorts of evidence in the fossil record and when you look at our own physiological makeup to understand that that fat was ultimately truly designed to be our primary source of fuel, primarily not just burning fatty acids, right? But ketones. So fatty acids have twice the caloric value, of course, of carbohydrates, but through ketones can supply 4 times the amount of energy. And if we're going to have large brains, that use as an adult human up to 25% or so of our total metabolic, our total metabolic need, then you want the most efficient fuel for fueling that.
Yes, absolutely.
And all the mitochondrially dense area, regions of our physiology operate best and most efficiently, utilizing fatty acids and particularly ketones in the presence of oxygen, right? That glucose, the only cell, so out of the 3 major macronutrients, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, the only one for which there is literally no scientifically established human dietary requirement, not in a textbook of physiology anywhere, is carbohydrates. We can manufacture all the glucose we need from a combination of protein and fat in the diet. Better to get it from fats. And glucose is at its most efficient use if a person is in a state where suddenly rocket fuel is needed for some reason, to outrun a politician or, I don't know, nowadays, and it used to be a cantankerous woolly mammoth, right? And so glucose has its role, but it's minor in terms of efficiency, right? In the scheme of things, our mitochondria are designed as little fat burning factories.
Can I interject here, Nora?
You may.
Because, for example, Dr. McCullough has written a lot recently about, you've got to be really careful with this ketogenic stuff. And my goodness, burning too much fat, dangerous levels of reactive oxygen species and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I've also heard people coming out against fasting, perhaps fasting's more dangerous than we thought, and it's very counterintuitive for the reasons you've alluded to when we look at the human experience and our history and our evolution. Periods of hunger are, it's only now that we have 24-hour food. But
right.
So these ideas of fasting being bad and too much fat burning being bad, I'm wondering whether there's any kind of backlash against this information, which is really empowering. Because if people out there are really empowered with a knowledge of how to be healthy and completely independent of everything, and if you like, burning glucose for fuel and eating carbs is almost a metaphor, isn't it, for being plugged into the matrix? You need your fix all the time.
It's the truth. Yeah. You remember my old wood stove analogy, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So like, and of course that works really well for me now because that's how I heat my house in the winter. If all so carbohydrates are basically a form of metabolic kindling. Your whole grains and your, sweet potatoes and your, I don't know what, are really, legumes, whatever. It's really kind of like throwing twigs on that metabolic fire. And then your white bread, white rice, fruits and fruit, especially, kind of more processed carbohydrates, I guess, are sort of like taking crumpled up paper and throwing that on the fire. And then you have things like, juices and sugary alcoholic beverages and whatever else. That's sort of more like throwing gasoline or lighter fluid onto the fire. And if I had to heat my house with nothing but kindling, I wouldn't have time to talk to you right now. I'd be down sitting in front of that wood stove trying to figure out where the next handful of fuel was going to come from to keep that fire going to warm my house. I look at it as a form of metabolic slavery. But if you take a nice big fat log and put that on the fire, now you can walk away and you can live your life and not have to be constantly preoccupied with where that fuel's going to come from if you are metabolically adapted to making use of it. I've got an issue with buzzwords, which I think are completely made up, like metabolic flexibility. Yeah, I'm going to switch from carbs to keto. And there's many people, for starters, practicing what are called keto, so to speak. As there are, I mean, there are many versions of that as people claiming to practice it, which is why I have a very specific definition of what it is that I have determined to be the most I guess the most healthy approach to that term, right? Which is using, primarily animal source foods and fats of uncompromising quality and sourcing, right? Moderating the protein intake, because I see excessive protein actually is quite problematic, just as problematic as too much sugar. It's a moderate thing. But you're getting your primary calories from fat, which doesn't mean more fat is better. It just means that calorically, what's on your plate, fats being double the caloric value of protein or carbohydrates, it's not that hard for fat to dominate calorically in a way that doesn't have your food floating in grease,
A lot of people struggle to imagine a plate that's predominantly fat, don't they? I mean, that but maybe that's
in terms of calories, not in terms of quantity of fat piled on the plate. It's not like I, smear lard all over everything I consume, although that is a great source of vitamin D if it was pasture fed. But it really has to do with, being really mindful of the quality of the food that you're consuming. And if you're switching back and forth all the time, you never quite fully get into ketosis. You're relying, you go through a period where you're using more fatty acids. I saw that article you talked about. Are they talking about fatty acid oxidation or peroxidation?
Fatty acid
because
oxidation.
If you're using, right, I mean, they may have claimed oxidation, but I suspect the real problem comes in part with peroxidation through excessive glucose being present at the same time you're trying to,
Okay, so at the same time you've got high levels of glucose and you're on high fat.
And high levels of fat. That's putting a fuse on a powder keg, in a manner of speaking. It's not a good combo.
In terms of generating reactive oxygen species and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yep. And also I think that, and something I probably didn't emphasize enough in my work, is the importance of vitamin E, which of course helps to protect against peroxidation, right? Fat peroxidation.
Yeah.
And if you're consuming more fats, your requirement for something like vitamin E may go up a bit, because you're looking to maintain the integrity of those fats. I mean, saturated fat by its very nature is inherently resistant to oxidation. But if you're cooking using high heat or you're using something that is just sat too long, rancid anything is, not good for anybody.
No.
And so doing things to kind of compensate for the increased fat content of your diet by protecting the integrity of that fat using things like vitamin E and other fat soluble protective nutrients is not a dumb thing. When people talk about going back and forth, I initially commissioned, it was actually the first ever Pulitzer Prize winning political cartoonist. We sat next to each other in high school biology class back in Minnesota, and he's a longtime friend of mine. And I got him to create these brilliant illustrations that were supposed to go into my most recent book. And then Simon & Schuster said, yeah, we don't want to do illustrations. Like, okay, great. But one of the ones I had him do, I told him what I wanted, and then he created it. It was great. Was some guy sitting in the middle of a road dining, It's sort of like if you're trying to constantly live in the middle of the road, it's not a happy, and there's a huge, 18-wheeler truck coming around the corner. it's not a positive outcome in the long run. You kind of have to pick and choose. To adopt a fully efficient, what I call, effective ketogenic adaptation, it takes time to get there. It's not something you can do one day to the next. I'm going to eat carbs today and I'm going to go and I'm going to just try to do keto tomorrow, whatever that means. You can do nothing but seed oils and, processed protein bars or something and be so-called keto. That's not necessarily a good strategy for health.
No.
I'm also not actually, I know that a lot has been made of fasting and intermittent fasting. I'm actually not a huge fan. So for a couple of different reasons. For one reason being, if people want to do a little of that, eat within a certain window during the day, maybe that's okay. But you have to be extra mindful of making sure you do get the nutrition that your body requires when you do sit down to eat, and that you're not just, oh God, I haven't eaten in 10 hours. Now I'm going to, chips and, whatever,
It has
or
to be
pork
combined
rinds
with,
or whatever it
yeah,
is.
you have to combine a high degree of nutritional awareness, don't you? With I think you have to do that anyway, but certainly if you're doing a restricted window of eating or any kind of fasting, really.
Fasting is not a nutritional strategy, right? And we know, I have a few studies laying around actually. We're looking at that now with some of my with the board of directors. We're talking about wanting to talk a little more about this because the nutritional value of food that was grown 50 years ago is substantially less, right, than the nutritional value of foods grown today, in part because of depleted soils, but also contaminated
I
soils.
think you
There are
meant
certain
that.
pesticides.
You meant that the other way around, yeah? So they were more nutritious in the past and less nutritious.
Yeah, didn't I?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's less today. So to consume something that grew out of the ground today, you're getting, no matter how organically you think you're growing, although there are things you can do to substantially, radically improve the nutritional value of the soil that you're growing your food in. But most people are not getting food grown like that. Even if you're getting it organic, the meaning behind organic has been so stripped of almost any meaning, other than you're not getting GMO and they can't use pesticides while they're growing, but that doesn't mean they can't spray chemicals on it after it was picked, you know, and that sort of thing. So if we're consuming, even if we're trying to get the healthiest food in us we can get, the nutritional value of the food we consume today isn't what it could be, a lot of it, and then you decide you're not going to eat, as if that was a nutritional strategy. You can run into, I'd say, what's the term for this? Diminishing returns over time. You're gradually depleting yourself of nutrition, and I don't think that's the smartest thing. The other thing that happens when you stop eating is that your body says, there's a famine. And your body will dial back its metabolic efficiency in order to hoard as many calories as it can, just to keep you alive. It's not necessarily hoarding every nutrient that it can, but so it's a way of gradually making yourself more susceptible to metabolic dysfunction if you ever do fall off that effective ketogenic adaptation wagon. If so, the dietary approach that I came up with, which I sort of call my primogenic approach now, because I really want to distinguish myself from the so-called paleo crowd or the keto crowd, which is, again, it's been heavily commercialized, and there are lots of crappy versions of that out there.
Yeah.
Again, food of uncompromising quality and sourcing, and maximum nutrient density, but also moderating things like protein, which in excess can lead to problems, especially as we age. And especially, if ever cancer was an epidemic, it's now, for reasons I think we both understand. But once you've lived long enough, we all know that glucose is a major fuel, and fructose for cancer, like huge. It's cancer's candy.
Yes.
But also, what a lot of people don't realize is that just being ketogenic in ketogenically well adapted isn't necessarily protection from cancer, because there's a, you read about mTOR, of course, in Primal Body, Primal Mind.
Yes.
What a lot of people don't realize is that mTOR plays a factor. So we live long enough, we get exposed to enough crap in our environment, the cells start to mutate, right? And having a single cancer cell in your body is not a problem in and of itself. It's the proliferation of that cancer, right? It's metastasis that kills people. The primary mechanism of metastasis is driven by mTOR. So when you are consuming protein in excess of what you actually need for your own maintenance and repair, it is an impetus for cellular proliferation, right? This is one of the reproductive mechanisms that kind of forge the engines of life, right? If you're a baby, a child, a teen, you're a pregnant woman, lactating or whatever, okay, a little more protein makes sense, of course, because you need to be able to make new cells as you're growing and developing. But now you're an adult, you're fully, you've grown as much as you're going to grow in the right directions anyway. And you don't have that need to be constantly adding new cells, which takes a lot of energy. All that excess protein is going to do is provide an impetus for cellular proliferation, which takes away from your own maintenance and repair. So the way that what's become popular in terms of creating autophagy is all this fasting stuff, but you can't fast forever. And more fasting is not necessarily better. That protein moderation approach that I talk about gives you all of the benefits of fasting without ever actually having to be hungry.
What about autophagy? Can you get into autophagy?
Well, it's the whole idea. So, like, if you're only consuming enough protein to just basically meet your basic needs for maintenance and repair, but you're not exceeding that, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of sends a message to you physiologically that, I guess it's too expensive. We'll put it in modern day economic terms and housing terms, right? It's too expensive to build a new house right now, so let's just fix up the one we've got. And that's sort of what autophagy is about, is cleaning out the garbage, in your cells and helping to detoxify those cells and helping to maintain and repair any damage that may be happening within the cell. And if you're constantly trying to flip-flop back and forth, I call metabolic flexibility metabolic confusion. And I don't think it's a healthy thing. It sounds very lovely.
Yeah.
But
what about? Metabolic flexibility, metabolic adapt. Yeah. Okay. I won't use that term, but to me, I found it helpful in terms of just being able to, wake up in the morning and not have to sort of reach for a bowl of cereals and just get on with your day. Because my body's fat adapted, and I can run I can go until 4 o'clock or even the evening before I think about eating if I've got a busy day. So during those hours, my glucose level is going to drop. I'm going to be burning most of my readily stored glucose, I assume, and I'm going to be running on fat if I've only eaten the previous day. So if I then in the evening eat, maybe a reasonable amount of carbohydrates on my plate in my meal,
utilizable, like starchy stuff.
Yeah, potatoes, peas, carrots, maybe some broccoli or something like that. I'm going to shift into burning that glucose, aren't I? Because glucose is burned preferentially. But
it's burned preferentially only because your body's obsessed with maintaining the lowest necessary levels of glucose.
Okay, right.
Okay.
Just at
any given time
in your body, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. There's only about a teaspoon that's allowed in a healthy person at any given time.
Yeah.
And when you if you consume something that has 10 grams, of glucose and or sugar, utilizable carbohydrate, now you've got double, right? And your body's going to work very hard at getting rid of that before it switches over to that other more efficient source of fuel.
But what about in that what I was just saying a moment ago? So you've gone through the day, and then you have a meal, and it spikes your insulin. Obviously, you're now burning glucose, and then that will sort of change over the ensuing hours. Maybe I don't eat until the next day. I mean, I don't I don't routinely have one meal a day, but supposing I did, I feel I could handle it. I am, fat adapted. I am in ketosis quite a lot of the time, but I do eat carbs simply because my wife and my family do. So I probably end up eating a few more than I otherwise would if I lived alone, for example. Are you saying that flipping between burning fat and then burning glucose, do you think that's problematic? Would it be
I think
better
a tiny little bit of it might be okay. I can't tell you how many people who, it's like all their health problems cleared up. Their thinking is clear. They're not ADD anymore. They're, they're operating really well energetically. Their inflammation levels have gone down, etc. And then Christmas comes along,
Yeah.
And I get these chaotic emails from people saying, "Oh my God, I can't get it back. I can't, I'm just, I'm a wreck. I'm having a hard time." Metabolic derangement is kind of, it is the condition of our time. It is so easy to become metabolically deranged. And once you have been metabolically deranged, it's very, very, very hard it's almost like, alcoholism or something like that,
What exactly do you mean by metabolic deranged?
In other words, you go into crazy roller coaster rides with insulin and blood sugar mismanagement and all that kind of thing. It's kind of like it all comes roaring back. So say somebody decides, okay, they haven't had a drink in a year, but now they go out on a bender. It's very, very hard for them to just go back to not having any, right?
Okay, yeah.
And it's like the cravings come back, that whole mindset.
Yeah.
And our culture makes it so easy to fall off that bandwagon. So I'm not trying to criticize you for, if you have the occasional, because it looks to me like I don't think you ever weighed 300 pounds, right? But the average person that has had a lot of weight problems, if they fall off that wagon, it can be extremely hard for them to go back into that state of fully adapted ketogenic, metabolism. And I'm not saying they can't do it. It's just, it's hard, it's hard. Yeah. So people trying to sell metabolic flexibility, it's something that sounds lovely. And I think it's kind of a problem.
So do you think ketosis, sorry to interrupt you again, Nora, but do you think that you could remain in ketosis and that's a much safer, better or more optimal state to be in?
Yes, especially if you've ever been metabolically compromised and that kind of thing. Okay. Once you make that, that you take those steps toward full adaptation, and it takes a couple of months for a lot of people, some people up to 6 months to really fully get there.
Yeah.
It can be unraveled and it can be very difficult to get it back. It's not impossible. It just becomes more of a challenge. And it's very frustrating for a lot of people that, whose body just no longer really tolerates, high amounts of carbohydrates. Look, our species, so fruit ripens in the fall, right? And I think that insulin resistance was an adaptation to the long winter months of relative scarcity in terms of, or maybe either scarcity or just less predictable ability to obtain food, right? It's harder in the winter. So there is an adaptive mechanism behind insulin resistance that allows people to survive for longer periods of time on the body fat that they've accumulated from gorging themselves on fruit in the fall and that kind of thing. The way I see it, the majority of people, of course, I mean, 99% of people really are operating in a state of what I call metabolic enslavement, with that dependence on blood sugar as a primary source of fuel. It's not the natural state of humankind. And, most people aren't really much more than one or two missed meals from a state of total metabolic chaos, in mental, emotional, cognitive. When you're relying on blood sugar, your cognitive function, your mood, everything is doing this all the time.
Yeah.
And when we're moving into a place where there may be greater food scarcity, right? Where it's harder and harder to obtain nutrient dense foods that are, reliably high quality and all that kind of thing, or grocery store shelves are going empty. God, help. What's going to happen in the streets? And something I wanted to do to kind of, I did an N of one experiment that I do not recommend people try at home, and I'll never do it again. But I just kind of wanted to see what would happen if, in my state of being very, very well adapted ketogenically, I decided to see how long I could go without food.
Yeah.
I managed 21 days. I could have gone longer. I just thought, okay, 21 days, me and Gandhi. Awesome. I'm done, because it was like I was sick of not eating. I wasn't starving. I didn't feel, I wasn't struggling. I didn't have weird mood swings and, brain fog and that, that, that emotional state that rhymes with itchy. Uh, I didn't suffer any of that. My energy level. So for that full 21 days from the outset, I was already ketogenically adapted. So I didn't have to go through that whole thing.
Yeah.
My head was just as clear. My energy was just as functional
Yeah.
at day 21 as it was day one. I went back to eating because, of course, it's stupid not to eat for too long. But I just wanted to know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Imagine grocery store shelves go empty, but you're still able to think clearly. You're still able to function, you know, right? We're
Absolutely.
designed to go through
No need to
periods
panic.
of feast or famine or whatever. And, if the degree to which you're able to be relying on that log burning on your metabolic fire, hopefully a great big one, which, we all carry enough body fat, especially women, but that we've got 100,000 calories or more that we can draw from if we have to. I'm not saying it's smart to do that, because it's not just about energy, it's about nutrients, right? So,
And there are
uh,
sometimes toxins sequestered in the fat as well, on there, which can be problematic,
that
especially if
can be
you,
an issue. Yeah,
yeah,
for people that are overweight and whatnot, who may be overweight in part because their bodies are protecting them from, by storing that stuff, instead of releasing it, and then it gets released and it can be uncomfortable.
yeah.
Um, but but if your diet was clean, prior to that and all that,
Yeah, it's good to know
you
that you
just
can delegate.
imagine the survival advantage of being able to maintain clear-headedness
Absolutely.
through crisis, right?
And
That's
not
how,
panicking, thinking, shit, I've got to eat today, tomorrow, and therefore prioritizing your activities around making a meal when in fact you might need to prioritize other things. You might need to, I don't know, you might need to walk a long distance to get to.
yeah, yeah, right. So again, we became human effectively by surviving disasters, um, and I think that, if you're able to maintain, um, that very, very efficient metabolic state. And the thing is, like, once you've been ketogenic long enough, you find that when you're looking at a ketone meter, the ketones go down actually over time. The Inuit, there was one person who I don't think is terrible as bright as people like to think they are, who insisted that the Inuit were never ketogenic because when their ketone levels are tested, eating their native diet, they don't have ketones. No, they're just much more efficient at using them. They don't build up in their bloodstream. They're used right away, right?
Yeah,
And
produce food.
so, I think most of what people are calling keto nowadays kind of isn't. Um, And if you're trying to eat fat and glucose and, whatever, um, again, glycation is the primary source of aging, not
Yes.
fat oxidation, right? And
Can I just to
yeah,
clarify one point? Again, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It will break your train,
no,
but
go ahead. No,
um, the idea that fat is a cleaner burning fuel
way
than
cleaner.
glucose. I mean that is still a fact, isn't it? There's no new research that suddenly overturned the fact that generally it's a cleaner burn. What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, it's a cleaner source of fuel. And it's a you know, the benefits of extremely well adapted, ketogenic metabolism, you know, are numerous enough that, it's like the New York phone book or something. You can list all of these benefits. You lower inflammation, you stabilize the brain, people um, that are normally prone to neurological instabilities like, seizures or bipolar disorder, whatever, those things smooth out, things level out. People are clear. They don't suffer brain fog like they used to. Um, I mean, the immune benefits just sort of go on and on. And yes, I mean, if you're eating crappy fat or fat that's overly oxidized, peroxidized, shall we say, rancid, like you're cooking on, using too high a heat, or maybe you're just trying to cram too much fat into your body. Um, that's not necessarily a great thing either.
What
But
about linoleic acid? Do you think one needs to keep the linoleic acid down, avoiding fats?
well,
High
seed
in
oils, right?
seed oils,
Yeah, yeah.
pork fat and stuff like that, maybe higher in linoleic acid than.
Well, it's also higher in vitamin D and other, nutrients. Like, pork fat has some great qualities if it comes from sources that where the animals were raised out in fresh air and sunshine. It's the richest natural source of vitamin D3 in our modern day diets is actually lard. Who knew?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It is
so
difficult to source, though, isn't it? I mean, fully. I mean, if hogs were sort of running around under the trees, rooting up truffles or whatever it is they do, you know, if you could eat that sort of pork fat that was really, really, not sort of
or
just fed the grain diet, the local.
right. When they're raised in a way that is a little more pristine, it's an extremely healthy fat.
Okay.
But yeah, so we get, linoleic
Linoleic
acid
acid.
um, is present in animal source fats, but in smaller quantity, obviously, than processed seed oils, which our ancestors really, other than, I mean, I don't know, seeds found in the wild that, I don't know, would have formed a negligible part of our evolving human diet.
Yes.
We're just not designed to deal super well. But of course, omega-3 fatty acids are also very highly polyunsaturated. But when they come with saturated fat, in other words, when you're getting it naturally within its protein matrix, and there are other fats that also have intrinsically are resistant to oxidation. Saturated fat protects those delicate, fats and helps to move them around the body a little more safely. I worry about people who consume too much fish oil, and that kind of thing, which I think is problematic. Once you remove the fat from its protein matrix and all the other nutrients that are there, it becomes a lot more unstable. So, it's yeah, I mean, seed oils are definitely a problem.
Yeah.
And it is probably the number one fat, the number one consumed fat in the American diet tends to be stuff like canola oil and soybean oil, and both of
And
which are
does that
GMO
burn?
too.
Does that have a dirty burn? I mean, are there in terms of the reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species that are
Well,
created
it is pro-inflammatory, right?
pro-inflammatory? Yes.
Those things they activate those inflammatory pathways. So, and combine that with some sugar and see what happens.
Right.
And so I think, when they talk about the harms associated with fat burning, which is kind of a new thing. And by the way, Mercola doesn't, I mean, I just happen to know this. I mean, he doesn't write most of the articles he publishes.
Yeah.
He pays other people. They write the articles for him, and then he puts his name on them. He pays them to do that. I know people who've written for him. It was
Hmm.
not necessarily an unfrustrating experience for them, but um, so what his mastery is in marketing, and he knows that to maintain relevance, you have to be constantly, you know, coming up with new amazing developments and changes and things to go with the tide. And he's not the person I seek, whose authority I seek for a lot of things. His old website, his original website, did have a lot of really great articles. There's no question. He probably had the some of the best stuff on the internet in terms of health
Yeah.
information. But um,
One
but
wonders why he would sort of do a U-turn on so many things. I mean, I've seen
well,
him change his tune on things, which just makes me go, hmm. I mean, okay, I must confess I haven't read and trawled through all of the published papers that he
right.
cites. So maybe that's my fault.
Yeah,
That's what I
I
need to
think,
do.
so he interviewed me a number of years ago. He contacted me, said, "Yes, I understand you're doing some really interesting things. I'd like to interview you." Great. And we got to talking. Of course, everything is pre taped or whatever. And we were talking about ketogenic adaptation, whatever. And he says, "Well, what I'm doing now, because he lives in Florida, where fruit's falling off of trees wherever you go. You have to watch. You have to duck constantly because oranges are falling on your head or whatever." Um, and he has a real taste for fruit. He says, "Some weeks I don't eat anything but fruit." And I'm like, "Really?" Well, I'm very respectful. I was not trying to be antagonistic, but I respectfully disagreed with the idea that it was a good idea to go to sugar burning for weeks at a time and then try to go back, to fat burning. And eventually, he started talking about cancer, and I said, "Well, there's one very good reason. I mean, sugar is a cancer fuel." And and especially now, more than ever before since we'll say 2021, late 2021, it cancer rates have exploded.
Yes.
And so many people, you can have cancer and not know it, of course. And if you're giving it the fuel that it likes the most, um, just because you think it's a good idea, to have more of that fuel for stretches of time, it's not necessarily a winning strategy. I didn't word it this way with him, but I respectfully disagreed. That I just said I don't personally see the value in that. I just don't. And and I mean, we were agreeing 90% of the time. Everything was going smoothly until I disagreed with him, and he refused to air the interview. And it wasn't a bad interview. So, and I was also interviewed once, well, more than once actually, by Dave Asprey, and
Yeah.
we were in a hotel room, and he was doing all the taping out of his hotel room down in Austin, Texas, and so I was there, and we had a very spirited debate about some things, and uh, we were clearly not going to see eye on certain things, and I really felt that I gave the better arguments. But anyway, he eventually backed off, and we moved on to other things. But to his credit, he published the interview, and it was a really good one. It was a really interesting interview, and I think it was really good.
I think it
Um,
always is when people actually disagree. People like to hearing people disagree and hearing the answers, the reasons this way and the reasons the other. I think it can make
well,
for.
Joe Mercola likes, so everything is his investment is being in authority. I also was on the Oz show, the Dr. Oz show on television. And I actually I don't, you know, um I was never that big a fan of his show. Um, but I learned so much from being on that show. Because of course he created a whole empire, right? Doing what he did. And it was super interesting because his producers called me. I was actually in the middle of listening to a lecture, and my phone rang, and I saw it was from New York or whatever. So I left the room and I answered the phone, and it was his producer. And yes, we'd love to have you on. And is there a time where we can talk, for a longer period of time? I said, sure. And I got on with his producer on the phone. We talked for 2 or 3 hours. It was a great conversation. She's like, okay, this is amazing. This is wonderful. She said, let me work. I've been taking notes. I'm going to work on this and I'll get you the script in the next couple of days and we'll fly you out here. I'm like, what? Script? What are you talking? Oh, she said, you have to adhere to a script. I'll give you a script. She
What?
said, yeah, right, exactly. I'm like, bang, like, look, I'm not an actress, I mean, I it just kind of, she said, well, she said, you have a lot of knowledge and you may be inclined to use certain technical terms that our audience wouldn't understand. She said, we can't use any language on the show that would not be understandable to, I'm glad you're sitting down, a 4-year-old, not 14, not, you know, 40 or whatever. 4 years old is the mentality they were hoping to appeal to,
Yeah,
which says so much about the mainstream mentality, right?
absolutely.
And so that was a shocker to me. But the other thing I realized is that if you go on to the show as, say, an expert in something, you're not really the expert. You are a tool of the host. So, like part of the script, he said, well, so Nora, tell us about this or that. So I would say certain things. And then he would turn to the camera and say, so here's what Nora's trying to tell us. And this and so ultimately I was a prop
Yeah, yeah,
that was there to kind of inflate his own authority on the subject.
yes,
Right. And I found that just, and he was in no control of that show. He didn't even know one day to the next what the topic was going to be. They would just hand him a script and all this kind of stuff. And he came in and we did a run through. He was wearing his just sort of like jeans and an Oxford shirt and um, before he got all made up and everything. And he was actually quite nice. He pretended to be interested, in me, and we had a lovely conversation. And he was perfectly nice. So, I'm not saying he's a bad person. What I'm saying is that one week on that show, here's why grains are bad for you. Next week, here's why grains are so important, and it changed all the time.
yeah,
So,
that's another thing that I noticed from McCullough. He wrote the book, The No Grain Diet, and now he's saying that you need to get your whole grains. And again, this sort of brings me back to my suspicion. I know that there are some people that you can be got to, you can be bought off. I'm not suggesting that McCullough has been, but people can be corrupted, and people can change their allegiances. We've got to be open to all these things. We can't be naive to think that these things don't
yeah.
happen. And I just wonder, because, we said that health is such an important component of our lives, and it's a political tool. And if we're sick, we're obviously going to be putting up less political resistance to anything. So there's huge political significance to the concept of health, to healthy, functional units of humanity out there, able to get on with their lives, perhaps protest at things. If we're all sick, we're not interested in protesting. We're interested in getting better.
Well, that's something I said a lot in my lectures. It's like in the United States prior to the whole COVID nightmare, that whole
Yeah,
debacle. The number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States was a bad diagnosis.
yeah,
And if you get that bad diagnosis, do you really give a rat's patootie what your government is up to or
yeah,
what the
don't.
corporations are up to or anything else? You're in survival mode. It makes you extremely malleable,
Yes.
you know? And
So,
so,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So anyway, I mean, look, maybe we should wrap things up and pull a few strings together, or draw strings together. So
yeah.
there is no new research that overturns the wisdom of burning fat for fuel. I mean, that's really the conclusion here, the
Yeah.
big takeaway point. And burning fat for fuel, as I got from I must read Primal Fat Burner. Um,
Yeah.
but from Primal Body, Primal Mind, the main sort of message is that it's such a fantastically huge, useful component to a functional lifestyle that can enable you to live outside the matrix, that can enable you, when the shit hits the fan, so to speak, if you're fat adapted, you're going to be functional when everyone else, as you said, is looking for their packet of Twinkies or 12 bites or their
Well, or they're
breakfast
willing
cereal.
to commit whatever crimes necessary just to feed themselves and their family because
Yeah.
within 2 days they're starving to death and
Yep.
they're half out of their minds.
Yes.
You know, you're not thinking clearly if, and occasionally, in my practice working with the brain, I'd have, people who were extreme hypoglycemics, and a lot of these extreme hypoglycemics, they'll try to go all day, and then they'll down a Red Bull or something. But if somebody comes into my office and their blood sugar and they're dependent on blood sugar as their primary source of fuel and they don't have any, I can't do anything for them. It's kind of a waste of my time to even try to work with their brains because their brains aren't capable, of doing what they need to do you know, to learn, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
so, it's look, it's not that I don't pay attention. It's not that I don't read new things, but my message really in well over a decade now really hasn't changed. It's evolved a bit, and I've found new dots to connect, but they all intersect in the same place, you know?
Yeah,
Um, and it's only really kind of firmed up the conclusion that it really is the natural metabolic state of humankind. We are, by the way, the only species on Earth actually capable of relying on nothing but ketones full time, and we've got our big brains for that reason.
yeah,
And by the way, evolution isn't necessarily moving in the direction that it was previously advertised. It's not that our brains are getting bigger. We've actually lost 11% of our brain volume in the last 10,000 years. And in
yeah.
fact,
But
Cro-Magnon humans 20,000 years ago had brains bigger than ours are today. And it's because all we had these mass extinctions of megafauna that we were hunting preferentially, almost exclusively for our nutrition, for our food.
yeah,
For the majority of our evolution as hunter-gatherers, we were mostly hunters, and we preferentially, even in the Mediterranean region, where you would guess that there was a wonderful paper um, that I've cited I certainly cited in Primal Fat Burner, and I've talked about in my lectures, and I don't recall the exact, the chapter and verse of that. But the gist of it was that during the late, Paleolithic, um, that even in the Mediterranean region where you might suppose people would have gone after seafood because it was so readily available, they still preferentially hunted woolly mammoths and giant aurochs to anything that they were going to pull out of the water. That's where we got most of our omega-3 fats, where we got like the human brain runs on, there are two primary fatty acids that distinguish the human brain, docosahexaenoic acid and arachidonic acid, both of which are exclusively found in animal source foods and fats,
yeah,
right? And, you know, a primate of similar size to human maybe has a metabolic demand, maybe 8% of their metabolic demands are being driven by their brains. It's like 25% for us. So we need that efficient fuel to keep our brains running in top condition.
yeah,
And I'm sorry, carbs are not the source of that. I mean, carbs are glucose is terrific if you need that burst of rocket fuel, right?
yeah,
Sugar burns most efficiently in an anaerobic state, right? Where you're not getting adequate amounts of oxygen, your adrenaline's pumping, whatever else you need to be able to, I don't know, leap tall buildings in a single bound to escape something. Um, that's where glucose shines, And it's designed to be that quick burst of energy. And then, but do you really need rocket fuel if you're just driving, your car down to the corner market to pick something up, buy a newspaper or something? God forbid you're wasting your money on newspapers, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah,
So, no, if we're in a state where we're operating, with sufficient oxygen, for whatever it is we're engaged in, fat by far is the most efficient fuel for that.
yeah,
And if you're trying to, again, rely on glucose, then you better have your pantry better be pretty big, pretty palatial, and you're going to be, you can be storing away a lot of kindling to keep those metabolic fires burning.
yeah, yeah,
And what is the advantage to that? I don't see it. I truly don't. Plus, the carbohydrate-rich foods really don't contain nutrients in any manner, shape, or form that are necessary for fueling, our brains or our immune systems or anything else. You can consume things like turmeric and garlic, and they're going to have some medicinal benefits. But, I'll tell you right now, the ultimate superfood, something that blows turmeric and garlic and whatever else that people are trying to tout, black seed oil and whatever is like the ultimate superfoods, out of the water, is liver, you know,
yeah,
which contains just such a rich plethora of, especially vitamin A, which is so underappreciated. True vitamin A does not come from carrots. It's retinol. It comes exclusively from animal source foods, exclusively. The fat soluble nutrients we need to run our immune systems come from animal fats, D3, vitamin K2, MK4. Please don't take supplements that say K2, MK7. It's such a scam.
right.
That's not the form of K2 we evolved consuming. And of course, vitamin A, which is perhaps the single most important nutrient in tandem with D3 for our immune systems. And one of vitamin A's key roles in this age of cancer, folks, is to help your body maintain cellular differentiation, right? The opposite of which is tumor growth. I know of people who have reversed cancers. I'm not prescribing, but vitamin A can have a profound impact on not just preventing, but even reversing cancers.
Really? Yep.
Yeah, it's a foundational nutrient for that. And most people don't get enough. Most people think, oh, I need vitamin A. I better, have some carrot soup or something. No. Provitamin A is not, beta carotene is not vitamin A. It takes anywhere from 6 to 20 units of beta carotene to form a single unit of vitamin A. You cannot meet your retinol needs from plant-based so-called vitamin A.
So what's
I
the
don't
best source of vitamin A, would you say? Liver?
Liver,
Yeah,
hands down.
hands down, yeah.
I just the incredible nutrient density of liver just can't, and of course it's the richest natural source of heme iron, which is the form of iron that our bodies require. And it's also for us the safest, form of iron to consume.
Yeah,
And and I can't tell you how many people who, I look at their blood chemistries, and lots of people are functionally anemic and don't know it, and their doctors don't know it because they're not operating from functional ranges that actually mean something. They're operating from these lab ranges or reference ranges, which literally mean nothing.
yeah,
What people don't realize, they go to get their blood drawn. Um, you know, the values that come up for you for the various markers that they're looking at are weighed against what's called a lab range or reference range. And what most people don't know, and most doctors don't know, I realized, it's like, seriously, they don't know this.
yeah,
Those lab ranges aren't based on anything scientific. They're not standardized for anything. They will vary from lab to lab and area of the country to area of the country. All they represent are two ends of a bell curve of everyone that went into that particular lab system for blood work.
yeah,
So you're not getting compared to normal and healthy. You're getting compared to the person standing in front of you in line for the blood draw who is carrying the oxygen tank, and the person in front of them on their second round of chemo, and the person in front of them looking to see how they're doing on their new glucophage medication.
yes,
And as the population becomes less and less healthy, and believe me, they are, these ranges are getting broader and broader and broader and less meaningful to the average person that just wants to know, doc, how do I compare to normal and healthy? And
yes,
everything slips through those cracks.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I
Yeah.
mean, I do a lot of functional blood chemistry analysis, so which is based instead on a population deemed to be normal and healthy, and those ranges are much narrower. You know, those two ends of that bell curve is narrower, but it's a lot more meaningful to the average person that just wants to know, how do I compare to normal and healthy? And then if you see deviations, it doesn't mean you have pathology, but what it can imply is an area of imbalance. And if you know how to connect the dots between the plethora of markers that you hopefully have to work with, you know, a much clearer picture emerges from that constellation that you can really kind of see what that's trying to tell you. So anyway.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, but essentially, fat burning is still go-go, isn't it? Timeless truth. It hasn't gone. Well, it may be going out of fashion, but the point is, the facts still remain, don't they? And that's. And thank you so much for clearing that up, really, Nora. Look, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm very mindful
Always.
that I've taken a lot of your time. Maybe we can do this again, and
I would love that.
because I'd like to hear more about what you're doing now, but maybe we'll come back for another crack at that sometime soon, Nora. That'd be lovely to see you again. Do you have any closing comments? Do you want to sort of point listeners and viewers to your resources and things?
Yeah, well, you know, I still have my website, primalbody-primalmind.com. I do have a couple of newer blog posts. They're not, I won't say super new. I'm still working on a part 2 of a part 1 that I wrote there. But and so there's that. I also teach some online coursework. I have a year-long certification course I teach. And those students are like family to me. We meet live every week and go through things, and we talk about life and talk about all kinds of things, but it's become kind of like a family. But I also have an online course called the Primalgenic Plan, which is all about all the steps that kind of the program handholds people through the process of adopting this, really kind of long-term health-oriented, ancestrally oriented fat burning approach, right?
Yeah.
And to both nutrition, not just metabolism, but optimizing health.
Yes.
And I am also, would like to give a plug to the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation, ppnf.org, that because we're revamping almost everything within that organization. There's some very exciting new developments that are going to provide a lot of value to members. I do a live. I'm usually the person that interviews. Like we've interviewed Catherine Austin Fitz, we've interviewed Zen Honeycutt, and Moms Across America, and Stephanie Seneff, and Michelle Perot, and Nick Pinot, and Mary Holland, just interviewed her, Children's Health Defense. And, there are a lot of big names that we interview once a month. We do this live event. And if you attend those events, you have the ability to ask these people, questions that you have.
This is on the Primalgenic Plan, yeah?
No. This is through the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Yeah, I typically host those live events.
Yeah.
Most of the time, and they've really been. They've just been wonderful, and
I look forward to hearing some more about that. I really do. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it's
well, look, let's thank you so much for that, Laura. It's absolutely wonderful. Like I said, hopefully we can see you again soon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. I do hope you've got something big and powerful from this, that fat burning is not going out of fashion. It's just as healthy as it's always been right through human evolution. So that's a really powerful take.
Well, haircuts might change, but a bad haircut, even if it's fashionable, it's still a bad haircut, right?
Yeah.
Put things into the context of hair. Hair is important, right? So
absolutely,
anyway.
Make it culturally meaningful.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody, and do remember to check the website lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more interesting stuff on there, and do remember to join us again next time for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.